It is, as the member for Hughes has just said, too little, too late when it comes to this legislation and the broader issue of dealing with the scourge of rising anti-Semitism occurring in our country since the Hamas terror attacks on the 7th of October 2023. Make no mistake, this bill is necessary because of the repeated failures of the Albanese government. The Prime Minister has been stoking tensions over the past 16 months through his weak leadership and failure to act decisively to stamp out anti-Semitism. He has been missing in action on this very, very important issue. This is all about leadership, or the lack thereof. Australians look to their Prime Minister to set the tone of the national response to any crisis. The Prime Minister should have made clear through his actions from the very beginning that those who sought to spread anti-Semitic attacks here would feel the full force of the law. He should have been clear from the very beginning about the scale of the horror inflicted by Hamas and underscored Australia's allegiance to its long-term friend and ally, Israel. He could and should have used our laws and our police forces to clamp down on those who sought to weaponise the Hamas attacks for their own hateful purposes here at home. He did not. At a time when we were seeing an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism, the Prime Minister and his ministers failed to acknowledge the presence of anti-Semitism without concurrently mentioning Islamophobia, always seeking a moral equivalence. Neither have a place in this country. Both are condemned. But acknowledging Jewish Australians' experiences of anti-Semitism does not diminish the experience of Muslim Australians. The Prime Minister did not address this, and his failure to do so was an indication that he did not take the threat of anti-Semitism seriously. We saw ongoing failures to take decisive action against anti-Semitism in Australia. Anti-Semitic displays were not prosecuted, protests were not stopped, and universities were permitted to be used as encampments. Worse still, the tone was set incorrectly from October 2023, when police arrested a man carrying an Israeli flag in Sydney during protests supporting Palestine, allegedly for his own safety. Offensive references to Jewish people were made at the same protest, which to this day continue to be debated and forensically examined as to what was actually said. Existing criminal laws that are meant to deal with things like the urging of violence against groups defined by race or religion in Division 80 of the Criminal Code were not used. Hence, anti-Semitic sentiment was allowed to fester. Through the Prime Minister's actions, or conversely inactions, the Prime Minister sent a very clear message that despite what he might say, there would be no real consequences for those who target and attack Jewish Australians. Because of this Prime Minister's inaction, we are now experiencing acts of outright terrorism, firebombing of cars, targeting of homes, childcare centres, synagogues, including the horrific attack on the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne in December. And most recently, the finding of a caravan packed with explosives and an alleged anti-Semitic plot to attack several Jewish targets. In Australia, in 2025, who on earth would have thought this could be? This is now a clear campaign of terror and is not something I would ever have imagined happening in our lucky country, a place where for generations migrants have come across the seas to find safety, opportunity, and a chance to live a better life. This is not the Australia we know and love. Attacks on Jewish Australians are attacks on our way of life, attacks on every Australian. Attacking people because of their Jewish faith and ancestry is un-Australian. Under Labor, the Jewish community now feels under siege and abandoned. This abandonment traces back not only in the Prime Minister and his government's failure to take decisive action, but also in the diplomatic abandonment of Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. This government has overturned a decades-long bipartisan position on Israel in our foreign policy, as evidenced by voting patterns at the United Nations. On the international stage, Australia appeared to reward Hamas's terrorist attacks. Diplomatic abandonment has been coupled with a weak stance on border security, including the provision of visas to thousands of people from Gaza, a war zone ruled by a listed terrorist organisation, many without proper security checks. People on visas who sympathise with terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah should be deported today. Those fleeing Gaza or Lebanon should be turned back if they are terrorist sympathisers. They do not have a place in this country. This failure of decisive action as a leader is a leader in crisis. In the application of existing laws, the diplomatic abandonment of Israel and weak stance on border security all can only be for perceived local political gain. The Albanese government is more concerned with winning votes in Western Sydney and appeasing voters in inner city electorates than on ensuring the protection of Jewish people in Australia and maintaining our values and way of life. If you might forgive a brief digression, Deputy Speaker, we see the same callous political games played with regional Australians. To save their seats in inner cities from the Greens, Labor is railroading regional communities with a radical rollout of wind turbine solar panels and 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines for a political target. My point is that this Prime Minister lacks the leadership to govern for all Australians and act in the national interest. Antisemitism is inconsistent with Australian values and unthinkable in modern Australia. Australia must reject antisemitism, as it must reject the persecution of any group on the basis of religion or race. Jewish people have been persecuted persistently over history, and the recent 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on the 27th of January 2025 reminds us of the horrors of the Holocaust, with the death of some 6 million Jews, a circumstance that all agree must never be repeated. Former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard told a Sky News documentary earlier this year, and I quote, "Many of the anti-Israel demonstrations have been caused by a distortion of history. It's a misunderstanding about how Israel came into existence. It's a misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict. And because of that, I think particularly young people are developing views about this which are unbalanced and really not informed by history in any way." Ms. Gillard went on to say poignantly, and I quote, "The Holocaust, of course, teaches us where anti-Semitism leads if it's not confronted. That is the history of Germany before the war. It didn't happen all at once. These things happened a step at a time." So given we've seen that history, we're in a position when we see the first few steps to say no, no more. Let's start combating that now rather than watch this history just play out, end quote. Bearing that in mind, what sort of lifestyle should Jewish Australians and those of any other religious or cultural group expect? Rights and freedoms for all individuals, freedom of thought, worship, speech and association, rule of law, safety, justice, equality of opportunity, reward for effort and a fair go. At least that's what this coalition believes in. Yet Labor's inaction is tearing our social cohesion apart. Anti-Semitism is like a wound that festers within communities. Without appropriate treatment, it grows and causes destruction of the surrounding tissue, eroding community connections, relationships, and values. pitting neighbours against each other. While people in Mali, my electorate, might think this is an urban issue, the reality is that I've been made aware of anti-Semitism in my own electorate. This is not only an issue in inner city areas where there are many Jewish people living in close proximity to each other, but also in rural and regional communities. In small rural and regional communities, people often know each other and rely heavily on their social networks and connections, making festering anti-Semitism even more volatile. Jewish people in Mali tell me they don't feel safe due to open anti-Semitism in the Australian community, including the display of blatantly anti-Semitic propaganda in public spaces within my rural and regional electorate. An Italian migrant complained to me recently that his family came to Australia in the 1950s and accepted Australian values. Why can't newer arrivals? The ability to understand and subscribe to Australian values is essential for social cohesion and maintaining our way of life. I reiterate the concern expressed by Victoria Police about rising anti-Semitism in Victoria. The Victorian Chief Commissioner recently articulated this by saying, and I quote, "We've seen a significant rise in anti-Semitism. It remains our biggest concern." Commissioner Patton said that since the October 7 attack, more than 160 anti-Semitic incidents have been reported in Victoria. Accordingly, an increased police presence is now being deployed in Melbourne. Unfortunately, it does not seem this will extend to the regions. Evil is always present, gently bubbling beneath the surface, and strong action must be taken to ensure it doesn't start to simmer, let alone boil. To further illustrate the fact that anti-Semitism is not just an issue in the cities, I highlight an instance of blatant public activity by a white supremacist group in Mali in 2021, where a group of about 30 men were seen performing Nazi salutes and chanting slogans such as "White Power" and "Heil Hitler" while camping and hiking in a national park. The mind boggles. This bill is intended to help mitigate some of the government's failures. It modifies the existing offences in Division 80 of the Criminal Code that should have been used to stop the spark of anti-Semitism in the first place. The existing offences in Division 80 of the Criminal Code make it an offence to urge violence against individuals or groups on the basis of race, religion, and the like. They make it an offence to advocate terrorism or genocide. For months, the Coalition has been calling for the existing laws to be used. We have been saying that the existing offences should be tested and those preaching anti-Semitism should be put before a court. Why hasn't this happened? Regardless, the changes made by these laws, as introduced, are welcome. I only hope they will be enough to start to stem the tide. Inaction is no longer acceptable. The scourge of anti-Semitism in this country, must be stopped.